continue to jump on here. Okay. So tonight we are going to cover a lot of information because usually I will break this into two classes. We'll do potatoes and sweet potatoes, which you will soon discover are two totally different plants. And then we do root crops. But in essence of time and scheduling and all that good stuff for this spring, I have combined those presentations tonight. So I'm going to move on pretty quickly, but I have already put a lot of information in the Google Drive on potatoes, sweet potatoes, and various root crops, including all the alliums, and even garlic is in there, even though we don't plant garlic until fall of the year. I went ahead and put that in there for y'all, as well as some pest control options for each of the specific crops, and then a couple of videos. So I'll get you that link as soon as our class is over with this evening. But I'm going to start us out with potatoes. And, I always like to kind of start out with some history, and I'll always give you a little bit of lore and stuff like that too. But potatoes are an ancient vegetable. They were actually first cultivated by the Incas in Peru in 1621. They're technically a cool season crop that grows really fast. And you'll notice there that a potato plant does not produce new potatoes right off the seed potato that you plant, which I think is often a misconception, because in reality, it's that seed potato that is sending up a shoot that becomes the green plant above the ground. And as that plant grows, it produces runners, and then that's where those new potatoes develop on those runners below the plant. But those runners are, and those new potatoes are always going to form just above where that seed potato was planted in the ground. So basically what happens is that seed potato dissolves into the soil, and that's what's providing food for that developing plant. So that's why we'll tell you to plant those seed potatoes in a really deep hole or a trench. But you can kind of see there the new shoot coming out, and then the eyes of the potato, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, how we want to make sure that we plant those accordingly. But it's not technically a root, even though we put potatoes and sweet potatoes in with root crops. It's technically a tuber, and all that is an underground storage stem. So again, that's just vital for the nutrition of those new potatoes as that new plant grows. And you kind of see there what that looks like. And remember that however tall our plant is above ground, in essence, is going to mimic that below the soil level as well, kind of like you see here. So that's why spacing your potato seeds are going to be very important as well. Potatoes, they can withstand a light frost. And you've heard me harp on Mother Nature the last couple of sessions, because we never know what she's going to throw us and what she's going to give us. Here lately, of course, we've had some really nice weather, but are we done? Are we going to have another frost? And the likelihood of that is, well, I go out on a limb here and say most definitely yes, we will have another couple of frosts before we're out of that window. Also remember, when you think about site selection for potatoes, is that a hard compacted soil is going to produce misshapen tubers. You'll hear me also mention that when we get into root crops. So if we've got a heavy clay soil, which many of you have, we want to make sure that we get some organic matter incorporated into that soil profile. Because notice there, we want to plant in fertile soil. We want that soil to be well drained. We want it to be loose or friable. And then, as with most of our vegetable crops, we want about a 5.8 to 6.5 pH range. So again, when we say misshapen tubers, you'll see a little queen like this sometimes. If you ever wonder why you get weird looking potatoes, that's often going to be why. Anytime there's an impediment in a heavy clay soil, it just tends to stop growing, or it starts off into another direction. And that's why we see that phenomenon occur. Here's something that's really critical. We always stress when homeowners grow a garden that we like to do that soil test and make a lime addition in the fall of the year. But we have folks that get excited this time of year. Maybe they've purchased a house, or maybe they've just thought, well, hey, I want to grow a garden. But one of those key elements is if that soil test comes back for a lime addition, number one, you're going to spend a little bit more money on a pelletized version of that lime. But number two, if we're growing potatoes, we don't always want to be adding that lime. And so the more acidic our soil pH is right out of the gate, the more lime that's going to take for us to bring our soil pH up to optimal. But if we have a really low pH this time of year, we don't want to be making a high lime application because it can actually do more harm than good. But what also can occur more specifically with potatoes with that lime addition or with manure, and this goes with even composted manure, is that it can increase the occurrence of scab. Now you may be wondering what that is, but don't worry, I'm going to show you what it looks like later on in the presentation. But just to let you know, scab is something that is still edible. It just makes the potatoes look ugly. So if you are eating them for yourself, that's not going to be that big of a deal. It's still kind of ugly, but if you're trying to sell a few of these at the farmer's market or at the tailgate market, consumers, we're kind of a picky bunch. And if they look blemished, you won't be able to sell those. So again, it's something that's still edible, but it's just unsightly. But again, just to reiterate, lime or manure, even if it's composted, can actually increase that occurrence. If we are going to add manure as an organic matter, we want to do that again in the fall of the year. So I know some of you are growing potatoes on a little bit larger scale. Some of you may just have a row or two, but for those that are going to grow more, keep this in the back of your mind. Notice there the second bullet is plant where you previously had legumes. We just say that in a crop rotation because potatoes are kind of midline as far as feeders. They're not going to be as hungry as corn, which is technically a grass, or even any of our cold crops like the cabbages and broccoli. But they are going to require a little bit more nitrogen fertility. And so those legumes, remember, are capturing from the air and putting that into the soil. So those potatoes early on will really benefit from that addition of nitrogen. Another thing to remember is in your crop rotation sequence is that potatoes are in the Solanaceae family, which is the same as tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. Also the same as tobacco, if anybody's growing that for any fun in your garden. So make sure when you're rotating that you're not going back in the same ground with those crops. Oops. Yeah, commonly known as the nightshade or solanaceous plants. And notice there that we also have a few that could even be considered weeds. Of course, deadly nightshade or nightshade is a weed that's also in that same family. So again, when we think about potatoes, they are actually forming tubers 4 to 6 inches below that soil surface. When those stems reach about 8 inches, that's when you're going to draw that soil up around the plants, and we're going to cover half of those stems. That's what you're looking at here in this photo. What that's going to do is force those new potatoes to grow above that seed potato that we talked about a little bit earlier. So again, that's why we want to make sure that we're digging a deep trench when we're planting those seed potatoes. And then we call this healing up. You're going to repeat that about 2 to 3 weeks later, again, kind of dependent on the growth of that above ground stem. Make sure that you keep those potatoes covered. Otherwise, they can turn green. That's just exposure to sunlight is what that is. So again, that's why it's really important to dig a really deep trench before you plant. Now, the maximum tuber formation is going to occur at soil temperatures that are going to be between 60 and 70 degrees. So you've heard me probably mention a soil thermometer before. It's going to be important here with this crop as well. So invest in one of those soil temperature probes, because we again know that ambient temperature is not going to be what that soil temp is. Our soil temp is going to take a little bit longer to warm up in the spring, and then it's going to stay a little bit warmer as we move into the fall of the year. Notice there that tuber formation is going to stop at 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if you mulch your potatoes, then what you're doing is reducing that soil temperature. So about a 6-inch layer of straw is going to help you keep that soil temperature about 10 degrees cooler. And then again, just making sure that you're rotating your crops every 3 years is preferred. As far as potatoes, they're going to be very drought sensitive. They're going to be one of the first crops that's going to let you know that they're not very happy. So that's why we want to keep them consistently moist throughout the growing season, especially when we think about at flowering and then right after flowering. Can't say that word tonight for some reason. At those 2 times, that's when we have what we call peak time for those tubers to actually form. Now, what about containers? The big key here is that, yes, you can absolutely grow in different kinds of containers. Hopefully some of these you'll kind of think are a little bit fun. I call it upcycling. So you can use burlap bags, old bathtubs, garbage cans, laundry baskets, and not to make light of the situation, but with Hurricane Helene, we know that there was a lot of things that maybe got washed down river that you could consider actually utilizing for some of your veggie crops if you were maybe fortunate enough to fish some of that out, but just make sure that you sterilize that first. And the reason I say that to you is because I've actually already had a couple of phone calls about that. So again, we're not really sure what was in the river, but make sure again that you sterilize that. The other key thing here with all of these containers is to just make sure that you have drainage. Now in the burlap and the laundry basket, obviously that's not going to be a huge issue, but in the storage totes, garbage cans, bathtubs, anything else like that we're using, make sure that you get some drainage in there. Another fun one is planting in tires, the tire tower or the tire pyramid, as you'll hear it called sometimes. Sometimes you'll see these in kids' gardens that'll be painted up bright colors and rainbow colors and different little shapes like you see here. But tires are actually safe to be able to plant potatoes in. So if you don't have a lot of room, this is something that you can grow potatoes in. Now, in essence of time, I'm not going to read every one of these points here for you. I have those on the slide so you can read through and see how to go about doing that. Basically, what's going to happen if you take those 4 tires, you're going to start with that 1 tire and fill it up with soil, sow your seed potatoes, and as that green stem emerges, that's when you're going to put another tire over it, fill with more soil, and just keep that process going. And then you'll harvest the same way. You'll remove the top tire, dig potatoes, and basically you're going to have potatoes all throughout that tire pyramid or tire tower. So anyway, like I say, in essence of time, I'm not going to read through all that step by step, but that's something you can certainly check out there. What about straw? You can grow in straw bales or in straw, like you see pictured here. One word of caution here. My sister learned the hard way on this last year. You can't use hay. You have to use straw. There's a big, huge difference there. So make sure that you're, number 1, using straw, and number 2, make sure that you know where that straw is coming from. We don't want it to have been treated with any kind of herbicides, because some of those herbicides that maybe we were using in pastures or in fence rows could have a little bit of residual activity and can, in essence, later harm our subsequent crops. So just make sure that you know where that straw is coming from. Kind of like the soil that I showed you earlier, healing up when those stems start emerging, the green like you see here. In essence, well, where's my mouse? Here we go. In essence, what you're going to do is replace the soil with straw. And you want to make sure that you're keeping that consistent. You're going to have to keep refilling that straw. You can kind of see here at the bottom how it's already kind of creeping out, and it does break down a lot faster, obviously, than soil does. It's a little bit more work to do it this way, but if you don't have somewhere in ground that you can grow, it's something maybe just to try for fun to see what you can get to grow. Now, when we talk about planting potatoes, we always talk about chitting. That is a word, not the other word. I didn't do a misspelling there. It's C-H-I-T. But we call this sprouting. And we will often recommend chitting potatoes before you plant. Now, again, we all know that we get all excited in the spring and we don't really think about this a month or so before we need to be planting seed potatoes. And we may actually be past that window right now for getting seeds in the ground. But this actually, not only does it spell it out for you how to chit, but there's also a video link on how to do that effectively, and kind of gives you a little bit of a jump on the season in essence. But again, when we think about chitting, it's something that's been around for a long time. Go back to the Incas in Peru. It's something our ancestors did. We have records of them actually stating that they did this. So we have that documentation, which is kind of cool to read back on. Remember that, again, those potatoes are going to grow in a little bit cooler climate, and we know what happens here. We have a few days of spring. It's like we go from winter to summer. We often make that comment as we get into the blazing hot days of May and June. But again, basically, when you're taking the time early on to chit those potatoes, it's going to reduce your harvest by a couple of weeks. Now, it's not something that's necessary to do. It's just an ancient practice that has been done and passed down through generations. And again, like I say, there's a video link here that shows you how to do that. Now, here's another biggie when we talk about planting potatoes, and some of you may have actually seen this phenomenon. The one thing we want to make sure is that our soil is not waterlogged. If it's a little bit moist, of course, here in the spring is when we get our most rain in East Tennessee. So our soil profile is going to be a little bit moist. I know yesterday I worked in my garden a little while yesterday afternoon, and before the rain came in, and it was moist, where I'd turn my cover crop under and have a pretty thick layer of that mulch on top. So, that's going to be okay as long as it's not waterlogged and just soupy and, super muddy like some of those springtime rains will bring us. So just remember that, because that's going to cause all kind of problems with bacteria infections and with fungal infections. So make sure you got a drier soil profile before planting these. One thing to be cautious of, you notice here that I say use only certified seed. That's going to be really critical because those are going to be disease resistant. I've had some home gardeners that'll take leftover potatoes that they have in the cupboard from the grocery store. I will say not to do that, to err on the side of caution and make sure that you're purchasing certified seeds. And this is where it tells you that seed needs to be about 1.5 to 2 inches square. It needs to contain at least 1 or 2 eyes, which are these little sprouts that you see coming off these potatoes. If you've got a really small potato, I don't know, quarter, $50 size, then you can plant those whole. So we'll often tell you to cut your potatoes. If you're not planting them whole, make sure that when you cut those, basically what's going to happen is that your seed's going to form this callus over that open wound, and that's going to also help it prevent itself. It's a defense mechanism in that potato. It's going to keep itself from rotting. Well, right here's a cross section. So anyway, that's what you want to make sure is that you're getting an eye in each one of those seeds. I'll often have home gardeners ask about sulfur. You can certainly make that application with sulfur. A lot of our ancestors did that. So you would want to do that right after you cut those seed potatoes. That's when they're still a little bit damp and they haven't had time to form that callus. And you want that in order for that sulfur to stick. So notice there, it only takes a couple of tablespoons of that sulfur powder. Shake it up in the bag. You don't need a whole lot. You're just barely going to cover that callus. Make sure that when you're shaking that bag, you're not like shaky, 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 because otherwise that's where we could get some damage to those shoots. So be really careful when you're doing the shaking mechanism. And just a general agricultural sulfur will work perfect in that instance. And you can kind of see there what that coating is going to look like after it's been shook in that paper bag. Another thing that I like to use is this product here, which is aminocloprid. That is the active ingredient that's going to come under a lot of different trade names. I'm probably being a little biased here. Y'all don't shoot me for that. I usually try not to go down that road, but people always ask me what is aminocloprid. That is still used in tobacco. It was actually an insecticide to keep aphids, or gives aphid long control throughout the growing season, from when we transplanted tobacco all the way to when we were cutting or harvesting that tobacco. But it was noticed during that time that it was also effective on potatoes. I'm not exactly sure how all that came to be, but I can remember when my papa was still alive that we were basically drenching our potato seeds with a little bit of Admire, and that was given a season-long control for Colorado potato beetles. So if you've ever had Colorado potato beetles and you're out there picking them off, or you're trying to spray them with Sevin, or powder them with Sevin, or even spraying malathion, you've probably just seen them stand up and laugh at you because they have grown resistant to several of those chemicals. But aminocloprid, you're going to see it again marketed under several trade names. A little dab will do you. So this is something years ago we used to have a lot of homeowners that would go in together to buy a little pint of the material to get them through at planting, or you can purchase a pint of that. It's anywhere from $80 to $100 depending on what you purchase, but that'll last you for several years. But again, I'll reiterate, if Colorado potato beetles have been an issue, aminocloprid is a great product to try to give you season-long control. Now, when it comes to harvesting, this is another area where I get a lot of questions in late summer and fall. You're going to see that foliage start to yellow, and it's going to start dying back. That's just natural for those plants to do that. That's when you want to stop your watering, because that's going to, again, allow those tubers to mature for a week or two before you actually harvest. Another question is, where do we dig? Well, where that foliage has died back within that radius, because remember that first picture I showed y'all early on, the canopy and the drip line of that potato plant is going to be where those tubers were at. So that also kind of goes back to your spacing. So you kind of know within your row or block where those potatoes are going to be. When it comes to digging potatoes, of course, many of you will probably harvest potatoes throughout the season. I kind of do that just to have baby potatoes to eat on throughout the season. But if you're holding out and you're going to store these, you want to dig on a dry day. Be really careful. Use a tine fork, something to be able to lift those potatoes up. You don't want to be puncturing those tubers. Again, if you don't have a really compact, heavy clay soil, that's going to make harvest a lot easier for you as well. So hopefully that digging is going to be a little bit easier. Again, you want to harvest all those potatoes when the vines die back. Typically here in Northeast Tennessee, that'll be late August. If you don't harvest pretty quickly, as hot as it gets at that time of year, those potatoes can actually rot in the ground. So you don't want to leave them too long, or you're going to have a big stinky row of rotten potatoes. Make sure that you're brushing off any soil that's clinging to that potato, and then you're going to store them in a cool, dry, dark place. If you can get that temperature between 35 and 40, that's going to be excellent. One thing here that you don't want to do is rinse those potatoes off before storing. Again, just brush off. A good potato brush would work effectively because we don't have moisture. We don't want to introduce any pathogens before storage. Another point here is don't store potatoes with apples, because what's coming into season at the same time as potatoes is apples. If you'll notice in some of, well, I'll show you this sometime later in the season when we do harvest storage techniques. But you would always see apples in a different area from potatoes and a lot of other crops, because apples are going to put off that ethylene gas. and that's going to cause those potatoes to rot or to spoil a lot quicker. They get soft and mushy. Again, don't wash them until right before you use them. Now notice here that if you're harvesting, again, for baby potatoes, like I do, you'll have a crop late June or early July, depending on when you plant, but typically about 10 weeks. Now, a few problems that I want you to remember is that scab. Again, this is going back to organic material. If we got too much of that, it's just going to increase the occurrence of this bacteria from getting in there. It just, again, makes them look pretty ugly. Another word of caution here is if you're incorporating organic matter, you don't want that potato seed to touch that organic matter, because again, that's going to increase the likelihood of scab. But this is kind of what it looks like. This is a really bad case of scab. Sometimes you'll just get spots that look like this here, and it'll be just kind of speckled throughout. This, again, a lot of these scabs have coalesced, and that's a really bad infection. Usually you won't quite see it this bad. But again, it's all edible. You just have to peel that off. Another pest that we see often with potatoes are leaf hoppers. I can't believe I don't have a picture. Oh, it's on the next slide. But basically what they do is suck that sap out of the leaf, and you'll notice those leaves will start to curl or kind of pucker, and you'll see a few spots that'll start coalescing and turning brown through here. But anytime we see this phenomenon here in potatoes, because we got some phenoxy type herbicides that will also curl plants, but we don't get that rubber looking feel onto that leaf like we would with a herbicide. But anytime we see that puckering like this, often that's going to lend itself to leaf hopper damage. Now, these are really small little critters. This is blown up. Well, you can see from the penny here, lots of little leaf hoppers. It's one of those things, kind of looking at the sky, you can't like look at one star, you kind of have to look away from it to be able to see it. It's kind of one of those with leaf hoppers, but like the name says, they hop. But they're really light in color, which makes them a little bit harder to see than like something like a flea beetle. Speaking of flea beetles, here they are, real tiny, black. What you're going to notice here is the spilling on the leaf surface. And again, they're just basically creating these little holes, and you'll get these little white streaks on that plant. It can cause some leaves to die if you have a heavy enough infestation. That can reduce your yield. Believe it or not, this wouldn't be considered a really bad infestation. It's when all of these here would start to coalesce and form a big brown spot that then would fall out of that leaf, that we would consider really bad. But you can see what that stippling looks like. It almost looks like ozone or weather fleck from that plant. But again, a very tiny insect, but kind of easy to see. They're just going to jump just like a flea does. And then you've got the dreaded Colorado potato beetle. Now, any of those beetles are going to overwinter. Basically, think about your grub worms, right? That's basically what those are. That's that larva in the soil profile, and that's where they're overwintering this time of year. And they're, depending on which species a beetle is, they're slowly starting to rise up a little bit to the top. And then, just like Japanese beetles and June beetles and May beetles, they all become a major hindrance as things start to warm up. But the big difference with the Colorado potato beetle is that ability to develop resistance. Notice the word here, it's legendary. It's well known for that. When we think about crop resistance, typically the first insect pest to come to mind is the Colorado potato beetle and the cotton boll weevil, because those two really tough to eradicate and can cause substantial crop losses. Notice here that you're going to have adults and larvae, both are going to feed on the foliage, and then you're also going to see the eggs as well. So you're going to basically see three different life, you're going to see the whole life cycle of that pest. If we don't have any control measures, notice there we're going to have complete defoliation of those potato fields. I do have a handout that's just specific to Colorado potato beetle that's also going to talk more in depth about that amino aminocloprid that I was talking about earlier as well. But right here is what all three phases of that pesky little pest is going to look like: the adult, the eggs, and the larval form. And this is the Colorado potato beetle. But again, remember, any of our beetles that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this gardening series, a lot of those are going to look very similar as far as their eggs. Even the adult body is going to look similar in the larval form. So you're going to be learning a lot more about some other beetle pests as we move through the season. Here's another one that can be very dramatic. If you get this one, it can linger for quite some time in the soil. We haven't seen a huge occurrence of this in East Tennessee, fortunately. But if it does get into the soil profile, it's really bad. But think about blight. Most of us will harken back to the days of the Irish potato famine. Basically, what's happening is that it's infecting that entire plant. It's a systemic pathogen, so it's going to move throughout every part of that plant. Most of those spores that we're going to get for this is coming from Mexico. That's what that means. Thank Mexico for this. It's just kind of how some of those spores carry up the coast. And it kind of settles in these mountains here in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. But again, once it's here, it can linger for years. Notice one of the biggest things here to help alleviate this from occurring is removing all your tubers at harvest. That way, if you happen to have any of those spores, they can't overwinter. Notice again, as with any blight pathogen, which is fungal in nature, it's going to like those wet, humid conditions. Now, when I say wet, again, I say this every class, that doesn't mean rainfall. That means you irrigating. That means heavy dews. That means heavy fogs as we get into late summer. And of course, high humidity. So that can be lots of different things that cause that moisture. And again, this is just a picture of what that looks like. And I've got a publication just more specific to the blight. And you can see what it looks like on the tuber there. So very different from scab. Because those scab is more of a raised lesion. It looks like scabs, like on your body when you get poison ivy and you keep itching and it keeps scabbing over. Whereas this just is inside that fruit and it causes softness on the underside and it's really yucky. And the more that this progresses, then the deeper this is going to be. Totally not usable. Again, rotating every year. We've already talked about that. You're getting a handout on all the different kind of cultivars that you can grow. And there's so many, I guess, Old Faithfuls that's on the market. And probably many of you have grown some of those, the Kennebecks, the Yukon Gold, the Red Pontiac, and the Russets, probably the most familiar to many of us. But we have a lot of different cultivars that I would highly recommend. There's fingerling varieties out now, the little tiny potatoes, a lot of different kinds of cultivars. So this is not a complete list. Make sure you refer to that handout. And we're going to do a class on companions a little bit later, but I wanted to put this snapshot in here just so you would have it to refer back to, because most of you are probably going to plant potatoes before you do anything else. But you can kind of see what to plant potatoes with and what not to plant with. Again, you're going to notice tomatoes is going to be one we don't want to be planting too close, and then a lot of fruit. And then cucumbers, that's another one. There's actually a chemical in cucumbers that they stop the growth of the potatoes. So you can certainly have cucumbers in your garden, just have them a couple of rows over would be the best thing. But notice that they grow well with squash, cold crops. Not going to be any problem there. And again, just kind of showing you what some of that looks like, some of those little pests. Again, we're going to talk about some of these root crops here in just a few minutes, so I won't tarry on that just yet. I get a lot of questions on planting by the sign. So again, this is just folklore or maybe some of the ancient wisdom of the past. But if you do believe in this, you plant during the waning moon. That's from the full moon to the new moon. So this month that would have been, don't hold me to this, I'm thinking March 17th, 18th, somewhere in there. But that would have been the time to plant root crops, which would include potatoes, because anything that's producing their crop below ground is when you want to do that in the waning moon. You don't want to plant on the day of the new moon or the full moon. You harvest potatoes during the dark of the moon. That's said to keep them to store longer through the fall and winter months. If you plant by the signs, Taurus, that's an earth sign. That's a productive and moist sign. It's going to be a little bit better for planting and transplanting, especially when hardiness. So again, think about drought resistance and how finicky potatoes are. So that's why planting by Taurus. And then Capricorn is also an earth sign. Notice it's a little bit different from Taurus because that's productive and dry. So that's good for planting potatoes and other root crops. And it encourages that strong, hardy growth. So there's a couple of links on this slide that you can refer back to read more on each one of those little snippets. And with that, we're going to move from potatoes into sweet potatoes. Notice there I put yum yum. And speaking of, I hope y'all can't hear my stomach growling because I'm a little bit hungry talking about potatoes. But anyway, this is sweet potatoes. I always like to start this class out with talking about the differences between sweet potato and yam, because there is a big difference. The first thing I want to show you is a picture. So the sweet potato versus the yam, you can kind of see what that looks like there. But a sweet potato, tuberous root with sweet, moist flesh, same as the yam. Notice that the yam's originally from Africa, and it's not really sold here in America except at special markets. The flesh of a yam can actually be purple, but again, it can be toxic when eaten raw, but it's safe when it's cooked. That's probably one of the biggest differences between a yam and a sweet potato. So I won't belabor that, but just for fun, you can refer back to that. But huge difference in the sweet potato and the yam. And sometimes people ask me, well, there's white sweet potatoes, but a white sweet potato is going to look in similar appearance to this sweet potato. It's not going to be kind of fibrous and smooth on the inside like the yam. Okay, so sweet potatoes. Yams are not sweet potatoes. The sweet potatoes are also not in the potato family. Believe it or not, sweet potatoes are in the morning glory family. So if some of you out there, I know, love morning glories because they're a beautiful flower, like you see pictured here, and as the name implies, that flower opens in the morning. Some of you out there hate morning glory because it winds and grows all over everything and you can't pull it out. It's absolutely beautiful to look at, but when you've got it growing in amidst your potatoes and tomatoes and cucumbers, it just gets a little bit rowdy. So think about sweet potatoes being very similar to morning glories, whether you like the plant or not. It's going to have a lot of the same growth patterns. So notice here, another big difference between sweet potatoes is that this is not a cool season crop. You need warm temperatures to grow these tubers. Another cool thing about sweet potatoes is that there's a lot more cultivars to choose from. A lot of people like sweet potatoes because of the high health benefits. You can see there, provides over 300% of the recommended daily intake of vitamin E or vitamin A, which is good for your eyes, and that's also a fat soluble vitamin. So it's going to be a lot better for any kind of vitamin absorption. So another big difference between potatoes and sweet potatoes is how we plant those. So we plant slips instead of seeds for sweet potatoes. And this always seems to be a point of confusion for homeowners. So I wanted to make sure I covered this as in-depthly as I could. Slips are actually going to be shoots that are grown from a mature sweet potato. And some of you may have actually taken a sweet potato from the grocery store, which I wouldn't recommend planting that. Y'all know I like certified disease-free seed or slips. But you can take a sweet potato and cut it and stick toothpicks in it and instead of me trying to tell you this and show you this on TV, I've got a link that shows you how to do that. And you can kind of see the botany behind how a slip forms. So you can actually do your own little science experiment at home to kind of see how that happens. But kind of like what you see in this photo, you can get a lot of sweet potato slips from just one potato. So a big root can actually yield 25 to 50 plants. And again, that's going to be kind of cultivar specific. But again, propagation is going to come from those vine cuttings of existing potatoes, and we call those slips. You can purchase those, or you can propagate your own. Again, I'm not a real big fan of that just because you don't know what you're introducing. We don't know what or where that sweet potatoes come from, wherever you purchased it. 10 to 12 bushels of disease-free sweet potatoes should be bedded. That's going to produce about enough for an acre. 16 to 20 foot of bed surface is going to be needed for each bushel of sweet potatoes. So a little bit of math there, but there's also a little calculator on this slide that'll kind of show you how to do that. Typically, if you're doing the slips, we'll say you bed those about 7 weeks before field setting. So anybody that's growing slips, I know in Greene County, Myers down in Bulls Gap grows slips that you can purchase. They've already started that process. Oh, and looky there, there's the grow your own with the video link. So here I was trying to explain that when I had a picture. Anyway, you can read through that on your own time. Again, this is not all the cultivars, but it's some of the most popular. I think I've even cut that off on here, so you can't even read all of that, but there is an extensive list in your handout for cultivars. So when we're thinking about transplanting slips, we're going to do that by hand unless you're growing a large amount. So if you've got an old tobacco setter sitting around, we know that works really, really well for sweet potato slips because it's just like setting tobacco plants. You just basically skip one of the tines every other one. But anyway, that's if you're going to plant more than a couple rows. Sweet potatoes are going to be a little bit different. They prefer a sandier soil compared to probably anything else that you're going to grow in your garden, but they like well drained. So clay soils are going to be a real big no, just because you're going to get that really rough skin and they're going to be irregular. And I don't know if you can see these little hairs coming off these roots. If you've ever seen that phenomenon, that's going to go back to a really heavy clay soil. Not that that's a big deal, but it's kind of like scabbing potatoes. It's just kind of a nuisance. Any field that has high organic matter, we don't want that. We want to encourage that. We want to have higher organic matter in potatoes as long as it's incorporated in. Not so much with sweet potatoes. Again, we want more of a sandier soil. You don't want to be growing those on the same land more often than once every 3 years. So keep that in mind. Again, just crop rotation. Any time that you've got an area, I don't want to just say field, an area, even in your garden, can have different weeds. And I'm going to throw this in here because y'all know that I talk about this all the time. Keeping that journal throughout the summer months of what you're seeing in your garden, your insects, your diseases, but also those weeds, because weeds can be a telltale sign of things that may cause an issue for us. Perennial weeds specifically, because morning glories and sweet potatoes are going to be an annual plant. So anytime we have a perennial weed, think about hogweed, think about lamb's quarter, velvet leaf. I should have put some pictures in here of that. But any of those really hardy perennial weeds that you might have show up in your garden, then you know that's not going to be a good area for your sweet potatoes, because again, it's an annual plant. It's going to be really hard to control. Perennial weeds are just going to kind of take over and crowd out your sweet potatoes. Again, just remember, you don't plant sweet potato slips till after the threat of frost. A good window here is after May 15th. Who knows what Mother Nature's going to throw us. But anyway, as far as planting, make sure that you have a fine seed bed as much as you can, till that area really well. A 888 fertilizer, about 2 pounds per 25 foot a row, will be good to help encourage that growth. You want to plant the sprout or the slips about 9 to 10 inches apart. You're going to do that in the center row, and you're going to do that about 3 inches deep. And you're going to have at least 2 plant nodes underground and 2 or more leaves above ground. And I've actually got a video in here that shows you kind of how to do that, like we did with strawberries a couple of months ago, what that's actually going to look like. Water these well immediately after transplanting. You probably know that, but I just want to make sure that you know as you're planting these, that's just going to give them a little bit of boost. Know that your roots are actually going to begin to form in about 30 to 45 days. So about 30 days after transplant, that's when you want to side dress. And you're basically going to put that 2 to 3 inches to the side of the plant, just side dress that. And again, a 888 is going to work really well for you. Now, insect can be trouble. Make sure that you're following the label. And I think I put a label of both of these, the Malathion and the 7, not the 7 dust, but the 7 liquid in your Google Drive. But I think that's a rate, and make sure that you look at that, 2 tablespoons per gallon every 7 to 14 days as necessary. And we'll talk about some of that here in a minute. As far as harvesting, make sure that you're checking those roots for maturity. You're going to have about 4 to 5 roots of varying sizes, but the majority should have about 1 3/4 inch diameter and be about 3 to 9 inches in length. And you can kind of see that here in that row. But again, using a tine fork, you want to just gently lift those sprouts and the roots out of the ground. That says with a shovel, but use a fork because oftentimes those shovels, we don't know where that root's at, and it can puncture that tuber. Make sure that they don't come detached from the vine. If they're not mature, that way you can lay them back down and cover up with soil. Kind of see there what that looks like at harvest. Whoop. Remember, more so than with regular potatoes, sweet potatoes are going to bruise a little bit easier. And that can carry with it through storage. So remember that. You don't want to leave those sweet potatoes exposed to direct sunlight for more than 30 minutes. So when you harvest, make sure you're harvesting and getting them placed where they're going, because they can sun scald, and that's where we're going to get this phenomenon occurring. Bruising, sun scald, and then what's basically going to happen is it's going to rot from the outside and causing that entire potato to become soft and mushy, and probably only this portion back here toward the hand would be edible in the long run. What about curing? And don't worry, I've got a handout in your drive just about curing, but don't skip this step. It is definitely something that you want to do, because overall it's going to help improve the flavor and texture of those sweet potatoes. If you do happen to puncture a sweet potato, it's gonna help that wound crust over a little bit easier. It's also going to help storage. You're going to get longer storage time if you're taking the time to cure these. It's going to protect them from any kind of those storage diseases. So notice here that I guess the other big thing about curing, just I guess a word of caution, if you've ever bought or dug sweet potatoes and then try to eat it immediately versus letting one cure and say maybe wait 3 or 4 weeks, hopefully you can tell kind of a little bit of difference there in the flavor and maybe the texture of that sweet potato. I know I get kind of antsy. I don't grow sweet potatoes, but I purchase them from East Carolina from a friend, and I want to eat fresh sweet potatoes, and I have to remember, no, he's just dug these. Let's just let these cure for a couple of weeks and they'll be a lot better. So you can definitely just tell a difference in the flavor and the storage capacity of those sweet potatoes if you allow them to cure. So again, I've got a handout in there that kind of walks you through temperatures, how to store or how to cure effectively before you store, and all that good stuff. A lot of different options to do that. As far as do's and don'ts, you do want to plant okra near sweet potatoes. They are actually what we call mutually beneficial. So if you love okra and sweet potatoes, they grow great together. Don't store sweet potatoes in the refrigerator. That's when you get that, I don't know, fibrous, almost, I don't know. It's just a horrible flavor of the sweet potato. It almost tastes like, jicama or a parsnip or something like that. It doesn't taste like a sweet potato. So just don't put them in the refrigerator. Make sure that you're storing them where it's cool, dry, and well ventilated. If you've got a root cellar or a basement away from light or any major heat source, that's going to be good. It's going to give you a little bit lengthier stay as far as storing. And well, that right there says 2 weeks. You can go a lot longer storing as long as you don't have a lot of light, your humidity and your temperature is consistent. So with that one, we are going to wind up with sweet potatoes. And I'm going to have to shift gears because I have a different presentation for root crops, if I can find it. Okay. Bear with me as we transition here. I lost my button. Okay. All right. So again, just to reiterate, in case somebody wants to jump off before we get into root crops, lots of publications just on potatoes and on sweet potatoes, cultivars, pest control options, how to store, how to cure, how to harvest, and all that good stuff on both of those. And then as we transition into the root crops, same type thing here, you're going to have that same information. The thing about root crops is that it's going to encompass so much more than the potatoes or the sweet potatoes. Because again, we tend to, just as humans, lump those potatoes and sweet potatoes, because anything that's below ground, we tend to just lump them all together and say that they're root crops. But hopefully you've learned botanically how potatoes are very different from sweet potatoes, and hopefully you're going to see how various root crops are different from both of those as well. But basically, root crops are going to be underground parts of plants, and they're going to include all these little lovelies that we see here. We can have that taproot, we can have rhizomes. So think Bermuda grass here. I'm sure that's everybody's favorite. We can have tubers like we talked about in potatoes. We can have cloves like with garlic. We can have corms. We can have crowns, and then bulbs. So lots of different botanical means to grow root crops. A lot of these are going to serve double duty, which is why a lot of people like to grow these. So think about your beets. You can actually eat beet greens, not just the beet itself. Radishes, celeriac, leek, garlic, and then turnips. And turnips is kind of, probably a threefold, because some will actually use that as a fodder for livestock, as a cover crop, as a root source, and then as a leaf source to eat as well. Another reason that homeowners like these is that they're cool season, so you can grow those in the spring and the fall. And it's something that you can actually feed yourself year round with. You can always have a root crop in the ground for sustenance all year long. So what do we have to do first to have successful root crops? First of all is loosen that soil. Notice there, let's turn that dirt into soil. We talked about a lot of that already with potatoes. So a lot of that those same applications are going to apply here. The one thing I want you to be aware of, if you get funky looking carrots, just like those misshapen tubers, oftentimes that's going to be some impediment in the soil. That could be compaction with a heavy clay soil, or that could be rocky soils. Anytime that carrot or that root comes in contact with something, it's going to impede that root's growth, and it's going to start growing in a different way. And sometimes it'll just stop and it'll grow to the side. So that's why you get these funny looking root crops. And you kind of see that right here, how it basically just kind of grows around it. But again, very similar to potatoes. The only, well, it's not a big difference, because you're going to dig that deep trench with potatoes. But when it comes to, I guess, what we would call these smaller root crops, we don't think about the depth maybe as much. So whether you're in a raised bed or a container in the ground, you want to make sure that you're given enough room for those roots to actually grow. Now, just going back to the carrot, there's a lot of newer cultivars that have these little teeny tiny carrots, or the mid-sized carrots. And that's fine. But if you're growing some of those older version or cultivars like the Danvers, make sure that you've got enough room in whatever you're growing it in, at least 18 to 24 inches. So just keep that in mind. Just make sure that if you are growing in containers or raised beds, that again, well drained. Remember that raised beds are going to warm up faster this time of year. It's going to make that water management a little bit easier. Again, heavy clay soils can be a nuisance. Now, the other thing that you'll notice, I think I might have a picture of this later on, but carrots will get really hairy, really fibrous. Looks like they got a beard, or long hair, totally rocking out to the 70s. That's going to go right back to those heavy soils, or you're going to see again that multi-prong, just ugly deformed carrot. And often that's what it's going to be about. They just don't like where they're growing. Now, if you're growing in ground or even in that raised bed, south facing slope, you're going to get a little bit higher temp in the winter. Why am I saying that for winter? I will typically plant carrots in the ground, I don't know, second or third week of May, and I won't harvest those till around Thanksgiving. So I like that little bit extra soil temp on that south facing slope to kind of get me through till that time. Again, you want that loose, fertile soil. You want to be able to move a fork in that. Clay is going to impede that process, so that's a good test for that. If you go out there and you just broadcast those seeds, make sure you go back and thin, kind of like you see here, because otherwise you're just going to have those roots are going to be an impediment to another root pushing through that soil profile, and it's going to, again, impede that root development. So make sure you go back and thin those carrots out. I would not recommend planting seed by seed of carrot. I'd just go back and thin those out. Here's what I was talking about, the hairy, fibrous, weird, warty growths on a carrot. Fresh manures are going to do that too, just like with potatoes. Even if you're using composted manure, make sure that's broken down really well. I kind of like to go 18 months or even 2 years out with that. Just again, because you can incur some issues if you're not careful with that. You can sow a lot of these all the way up until September. You're going to just amend with a couple of cups of complete fertilizer. You're not going to have to utilize a lot of different fertility options, whatever you already have in your tool shed. Bone meal is really good, or anything that has a high phosphorus content is going to be good for that root development. Notice here the days to emergence, 6 to 21 days. This is going to be really dependent on the cultivar. So if you're like me and you go out there and you think you're going to get like a radish, they come up in 2 or 3 days and you get all excited about it. A lot of these carrots are not going to do that, especially some of our older trusted cultivars, which a lot of us are still growing. We're going to be 2 or 3 weeks out. So make sure that you remember where you've planted them. Make sure you mark those. They'll probably come on up. It just takes them a little while to get there. And again, just a blowed up version of what that looks like there. So let's talk about cold tolerance. It can vary with each one of these crops. So when we talk about root crops that are hardy, that means that they can tolerate a heavy frost. And some of those are going to be garlic, which if you are growing garlic now, you've already seen it up. It's already emerged through the soil line. Leeks, multiplier onions, turnips, and radish, all of those can actually tolerate a heavy frost. Now, if you're eating for the greens, that can alter that chemistry, that sugar content, because that sugar to starch conversion. So it can make those a little bit more bitter versus some of our actual leafy greens, that it makes them more sweeter. So keep that in mind. If they're half hardy, that means they can tolerate a light frost. So again, that's going to be some of our beets, our carrots, our parsnips, and our rutabagas. And then if they're half tender, you can get frost injury. That's where your potato is going to fall. So a lot of people will be planting those potatoes right now. I didn't really say this in potatoes, but Good Friday, which is sometime in April 18th, somewhere around there this year. But a lot of times people want to plant those potatoes like now, and that's perfectly fine to do that. But if we get green above the ground, you want to make sure that you cover those if we get a heavy frost, or God forbid, even a freeze beyond this point. So make sure you use extra caution there. A tender plant, that means that a frost will kill the plant. And of course, that's going to be the sweet potato. And then you notice there that some of those that can overwinter in our garden. I said I dug my carrots around September, but I've even had spinach, which is not on here, and some onions and radishes that'll go all the way up until January. Not so much this year because we got those days of extended freeze, not just frost, but 3 days of extended freeze. And at that point, nothing much is going to live through that, but in a typical year. Remember that root crops are going to require that cool weather conditions, and many are going to be direct seeded in spring and in fall. So don't think that you have to only plant in May to be able to have a lot of these. You can make successive plantings of these all the way up into September if you're going to leave your garden and maybe have an area that you're not going to cover crop, or if you're in a raised bed, you can have some of these root crops throughout the winter. Notice there your temperature is going to be a little slightly cooler than a lot of our tomatoes, eggplants, cucumbers, and things like that. Notice there when we get into the summer months, this is where we often run into a problem because we get into those extended nights of high temperatures, and that can affect root development. Think about beets. I'm not a big beet fan, but I've heard my granny often say that the flavor will be hindered a little bit by really high temperatures, especially at night. It'll alter their flavor profile, and they'll also be a little bit lighter in color. Another phenomenon that you'll often see when we get really hot is these bands in the beets. So if you've ever harvested your beets and they look like this, which is kind of cool looking, but often that's going to be directly associated with temperature. Whoops, what did I do there? When it comes to spring planting, make sure that you're just going by that seed package so you know when to plant, because it's going to vary from each one of these root crops. I can't give you an exact window. Even amongst the radishes and the carrots, it's going to be a little bit different. So make sure you're referring to that. Typically 4 to 6 weeks before our last expected frost. And again, making those successive plantings is very good. And then you'll see their potato, wait till that soil warms, typically mid-April. It's a little bit warmer even now than, I can't remember what it was. I actually wrote that down at the office and I can't remember. I meant to tell you all that, but I'll try to put that in the email for tomorrow. Here's another method that's really good for your root crops. You can do this called pre-germinating. I'm not going to go into every little detail here, but if you're really wanting to, I guess, get a jump on some of those slow growers, like the carrots especially, you're just going to give those plants a little bit of a head start. So basically all you're doing is soaking those seeds overnight in water in a moistened paper towel enclosed in a plastic bag. And this just gives you the recipe for how to pre-germ those. And again, I'm not going to read each one of those, but you will see some success doing this. I'm not going to take away and say that you won't, because it does give you a little bit of a jump. The thing to remember is covering with vermiculite. It makes it a little bit easier for those tiny little leaves to break through the soil crust. So remember, your vermiculite's a little different from your perlite. The vermiculite's what I call has the sparkles in it, but it's a little bit thinner. It's a little bit coarser than just soil, but it's going to make it easier for those seeds to germinate within that substrate. Again, fall planting, you can do that. I don't want y'all to forget that. It does take a little bit longer for those to mature, just because we're getting into those cooler nights, and that's where that plant growth starts to cease a little bit. And we also have less sunlight, which is going to make the growing process a little bit shorter. And here's a recipe, I guess, for figuring out your last planting date for the fall. So make sure that you go back and refer to this. Again, in essence of time, I'm not going to go through this, but always make sure that you're figuring out what that's going to be, so you'll know exactly when you need to be planting in the fall. And like I say, there's a little calculator in here that'll kind of help you count backwards in the fall to be able to reach that window for maturity. When you do sow seeds in the fall, a couple things to just remind you of and keep in the back of your head. Our soil at that point are really hot and dry. We start to see some of that blockiness form where we are so dry. Sometimes we'll tend to see cracking that occurs, and this is not just in the ground, y'all. We'll see this in our pots, in our containers, in our raised beds. We'll see if, because we all kind of get lazy. If Mother Nature ain't helping us, we're not out there consistently watering unless we're on a drip. But we'll start to see that soil kind of pull away from the sides of those raised beds or the containers. So, at that point, everything is kind of stressed, so it can make even our seeds a little bit more stressed to germinating. So kind of remember that in the fall, you probably want to go out just like you would for a pollinator bed or a wildflower bed, work that soil up really good, and then wet it. Wet it, not to the point that you could wring it out like a washcloth, but wet it, really get it damp, and then sow your seeds. You don't have to do that in the spring because Mother Nature does that for us, but likely in the fall, you'll have to do that. And I think I already said all of that stuff here, even though that was for summer. It's going to be more so for fall. Another good thing to invest in, we talked about this in cold crops, is floating row covers. That's going to be first line of defense against frost. Now, for cold crops, we were talking about that being a defense mechanism for the butterflies, the cabbage loopers that wreak havoc each spring. But for root crops, that's actually going to help in the case of frost. Go back to those a little bit more sensitive crops. The other things that's going to do is, it's going to hasten our germination. It's going to help exclude some pest also, just like it would in our cold crops. One way to probably make this, make it illustrated a little bit better is our lettuce beds, lettuce and onion bed. We can do that in the spring, and we can even get by with doing that in the fall if you like kilt lettuce. But keeping that covered, it just makes sure that we're keeping everything consistently moist. Again, I don't know if you can see this right here. It looks like a little hole that's been eaten in, but basically what we're going to try to do is deter slugs. They're really bad for lettuce beds, but when it comes to carrots, the carrot flies and things like that, it'll keep those from feasting on our root crops, especially if we're going to eat those for greens. Plus the green top is what makes food for the rest of the plant, right? You can also do what we call interplanting. So you can sow onions and carrots and radishes. A lot of people think that radishes, we plant those early on in the summer when we plant everything else, and then that's it. We let those bolt, and you don't think you can grow those anymore because it's more of a cooler season root crop. But that's a really good workhorse in the garden. And so as soon as you get some shade, start interplanting radishes, and it can actually be a really good companion for a lot of your other vegetable plants. But use that shade from some of those existing plants to do you a favor and grow some of those root crops kind of out of the way. Just make sure you're not growing them where you walk, which I did one year. Completely forgot I had planted carrots and they never stood a chance. You can also use cold frames this time of year. One word of caution there is that wetter is not better. You want to let that soil become a little bit dry. That's going to encourage those roots to go deeper. And then don't be mean, lean, no footsteps inside. So keep that in mind. That's why you want to have those a little bit smaller. You can throw an old blanket or a carpet on that frame if we get into a freeze. And then make sure that you have a thermometer in there for easy monitoring. What does that look like? And I've got a link in here that shows you some different cold frames, relatively inexpensive to build. Again, this kind of harkens back to the old days. If you've ever been to Jamestown, Yorktown, Williamsburg, and some of those historic gardens, you'll see a lot of different cold frames in place for that. Hopefully you can see that raised up here, what that looks like. But basically, they're just going to give you a little bit of a jump and a little bit of extra protection. So let's look at some of these individual root crops. Another thing to remember is the families of plants. And that's something that's not in your Google Drive right now, but I'll put that in there because that's something I want you to be looking at as you plan for your garden this season, and use that in your crop rotation as well. But know what your families are. So carrot, for instance, is going to be in that parsley family. Your aster family or sunflower family is Jerusalem artichoke and salsify. You may be curious what those are. I'm going to show you that here in just a minute. Brassicas, we talked about cold crops a couple of weeks ago. So this is where our radishes are going to fall, even horseradish, rutabagas, and turnips. And then goosefoot family, believe it or not, is where our beets belong. And first off, we'll talk a little bit about parsnips, which is what you see pictured here on the left, carrots, and then parsley. All of those are going to be in the same family. And you know, within carrots, we have a lot of weeds that are also going to be in that same family. I didn't put pictures of those up here, but think about your Queen Anne's lace. Think about your poison hemlock, your water hemlock. All of those are going to be members of the same family. Sunflowers, probably many of us are growing some species of this in our garden. Then we have sunchokes, which is what we see pictured here, that are actually producing a tuber that tastes very much like a potato, very much edible, but you get a little bit of flour or a little bit of color out of that versus our potato. And then salsify are all in the aster family, which are what you see here. We have both spring asters and fall asters that would fall into that family. But this ugly looking root right here is actually salsify, and we'll talk about that here in just a few more minutes. And then we have radishes and turnips, of course. We have rutabagas. All of those are going to be in the same family as mustard or brassicas. And then here is Swiss chard. That's another one. I forgot about that one. Swiss chard, spinach, lamb's quarters, all of those are going to be in the goosefoot family. So don't forget that a lot of our vegetables in our garden are also going to be members of the same family of a lot of weeds that we all hate, right? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on garlic, but I went ahead and put these slides in here for you to refer back to. And I've also got a publication in there on garlic. Again, just in essence of time, I'm going to zip on through this one and we'll go to beets. A cool thing about beets is that they weren't grown initially for that root that we all eat. They were actually grown for the leaf only. Today, we know that as Swiss chard. And there's lots of different cultivars. A lot of those are really colorful, make a pretty striking addition to our gardens. Plus, they're also edible. But the true beet came into existence in 1550 in Germany, but it didn't make its way here to the U.S. until the early 1800s. Beets, you can grow those full speed. You want to make sure that you've got ample moisture, because notice there they can get really stringy and can be really tough, very fibrous if they don't get consistent moisture. All varieties of beets you can eat for the green, or you can eat for the root itself. The biggest problem with growing beets, anybody will tell you this, it's overplanting and underthinning. So make sure once you do scatter your seed, make sure that you're going back and thinning accordingly. Beets, just like Swiss chard, are going to come in a variety of different colors. Baby beets you can actually grow in small containers, even on the porch. They're not going to need a lot of room or even a lot of depth to grow. So lots of different flavors and textures available for beets. Carrots, not going to be quick to mature. I've already said that. They're going to take a few months. You do have some of those little finger varieties that are available. You can see pictured here is Queen Anne's lace. So again, that flower is going to be very similar. Carrots, one of those that actually came to America with those early settlers here into the Southern Appalachia. Native Americans, they love carrots and they started growing them pretty quickly. The carrot can be mistreated and it's going to forgive you. That's another reason I love growing carrots. They take a long time, but if you can just be patient or even just forget that you planted them, it'll be well worth it in the long run. Very adaptable, very tolerant. You can store these for a long time. They harvest easy. Just a really easy option to go with. Just again, go easy on manure. Lots of different cultivars like you see pictured here. And again, these shorter ones, like the little pears, we're starting to see these grown in more abundance, especially in raised beds and containers. Parsnips are going to be really similar to carrots. I always just say this is the white carrot that tastes terrible in Melody's opinion. But parsnips are one that you can leave in the ground all winter. They're actually going to need that cold weather to be edible, which is probably one of the reasons I didn't like parsnips the first and only time I ever tried them. It was probably this very reason right here. I don't think there was nothing nutty about it, but again, I think it's just because didn't allow that starch to be converted to sugar. But you can harvest these in the fall. It's actually better to do that and store those in sand during the winter months. And we're going to talk about some of those storage options later on in the season. But basically, you can take a 5-gallon bucket, line it with sand, and just put parsnips and kind of layer those alternately. And good way to store those through the winter months. One thing they won't tolerate is heaving. So keep that in mind. That's when frost or froze ground, anytime we plant anything in the fall, we say be careful, make sure that we're planting it at the correct depth, because otherwise a heavy freezer tool will kind of gently lift that up out of the ground. Keep that in mind. Parsnips are going to be a little bit more persnickety about that. But you can see here again, kind of looks like a white carrot. And then we have the turnips and the rutabagas. So they look kind of similar. Might be hard to tell these apart if you're looking at them singularly, but together you can kind of see the difference. A rutabaga is actually a cross between a turnip and a cabbage. So a lot of people don't know that. It's kind of interesting how the rutabaga came to be. Most of the time you can use these interchangeably in recipes. You're not going to notice a huge difference. When you cook a turnip, that flesh is going to turn from white to almost translucent. Rutabaga is going to turn to a yellow orange. So vast difference on your plate when you cook those. Rutabagas, when we just look at that skin, it's going to have a much rougher texture and it's going to have a tougher skin. Rutabagas are a little bit bigger than turnips. That's not always going to be true with some of these more modern cultivars. But typically rutabagas will be a little bit sweeter, again, just because you have that cross with that cabbage, and the cabbage has a little bit higher sugar content than just the plain turnip root. Some people ask about the shape like you see here. Rutabagas can be just perfectly round, just like the turnip you see here. So they're not always going to have this little cylindrical shape. Again, that's going to be cultivar dependent. And then radishes, as we move into those, notice there, it's a great beginner crop. It's really easy to grow. If you have kids or grandkids, this is a fun one to get them kind of started with in the garden because they germinate in a couple of days. Again, it's something you can eat the greens. You can eat the fruit and notice the different colors, all kinds of different, I guess, sweetness flavors or hotness flavors. Just a lot of different options here. And again, You can grow it for the green or just grow it for the fruit or for the root, not the fruit. But you can see that's not a really deep little raised bed here. They don't need a huge amount of room to grow. This one up here is the Daikon radish. I mean, we say that all those radishes are edible. That one's a little bit more fibrous. It was created more so for a cover crop because it does have that longer taproot more so. And then that brassica component. So you get that stinky factor, which is a defense mechanism. So that's one reason it was created as a cover crop, like what you see here. But again, all of those are going to be edible. And then we have celeriac. So if you have a little bit wetter spot in your garden, this one likes to be in a wet soil. Sometimes you'll hear this called celery root. I actually think I saw that. It was either at Publix or Ingles. I don't know, a couple of months ago, maybe around the holidays, that I saw it actually marketed as celery root. I guess because celeriac is a tongue twister, hard to say. But it is a slow grower, even more so than celery. And if you've ever grown celery, you know that takes like a lifetime to grow it. But this one is going to be a much softer celery flavor, which is why a lot of people like the celery root. You still get that celery flavor, but not like the intensity with celery or celery seed. And you can eat that raw or cooked. And again, you can eat the greens as well. And then as we move into onions, we can grow those tops in cool weather. They're going to form the bulb in warm weather. You've got all kinds of different varieties, short day, long day. Some are going to be super sensitive to day length. That's all going to be cultivar dependent, but you have the publication with all the different cultivars in there. Remember that they're going to be a little bit more of a heavy feeder compared to all the other root crops pretty much combined. They're not going to care on the manure like some of the other root crops we've talked about. They actually appreciate a little bit of that. Just make sure that it's composted. When we think about East Tennessee, we tend to think about the short day. Those are going to be the most popular here. And our publication has those broken out for you with some pictures that'll show you the difference. Many of you are probably familiar with the yellow Bermudas. Those are going to be real popular in the South. Those are going to be marketed as the yellow sweet onion or just sweet onions, yellow onions at Sam's or Walmart, Publix, or wherever. You want to start in the fall for the best bulb formation. Remember that your sets are a little bit more reliable. So you have seed, sets, and slips, all with onions. So when we think about a green onion, what is that? What do we mean by that? Any onion can be used as a green onion. It's just how you harvest that onion. You harvest that bulb when it's really small. We do often, I said this a minute ago with lettuce and onions, a lot of us will grow those little onions to have that quick burst of spring flavor. You probably grow sets in your garden to get the bigger bulb throughout the summer months. But we do know that commercially, and we don't have any commercial onion growers here or green onion growers in the state of Tennessee, but they always start from a white variety. When we think about bunching onions, one thing to kind of remember there, they don't produce bulbs. Basically, what they're doing is forming a new shoot throughout that growing season, kind of similar to how a potato does. And these are going to be really winter hardy. They're going to produce throughout the growing season. Those shoots are going to be crisp and mild, and they're going to get really pungent as the season wears on. Notice there that scallions are going to refer to several different kinds of onions, but most often are going to be applied to the non-bulbing type. Scallions are what's preferred by chefs because they have a more delicate and a more balanced flavor and texture for fancy food, is what I always say. And then we have what we call potato onions or multiplier onions. And a lot of people in Northeast Tennessee have grown these just traditionally through the generations. People that are moving into the area, I get a lot of questions about these. What are they talking about, these potato onions? But it's just a different cultivar of onion. There's actually a couple of recipes in here that talks about how to cook with these. Notice that you don't want to overcook these because that stinky factor goes up a little bit. But anyway, a couple of different publications on these. But in essence, what you're going to do is plant these in the spring and then harvest in the fall, or even all the way through to the next spring. So you can kind of see what those look like there. And then we have leeks, which is what I call the big, flat, fat green onion. Not botanically correct, but that's kind of how I remember what's what. These are going to be long growers, so they're going to take a little bit longer, 148 days to get where they're growing. They're not going to bulb like a traditional onion, like you can see there. These are, you're going to have to plant a little bit deeper too. I like how their French refer to leeks. They call it asparagus for the poor. Now, remember, when it comes to onions, shallots, and leeks, they're not going to be considered interchangeable when it comes to cooking. So make sure that you're using whichever one that your recipe calls for, because your flavor profile is going to be very different with each one of those. So you're technically going to grow these very similarly, but if you're cooking with them, that's where the big difference comes in. And then we have shallots. So these come to us from French knights after they returned from the Crusades. It's actually a form of multiplier onions. They look very similar to a tulip bulb, and they won't set seed. So in essence, they don't bolt. And when they bolt, they're seedless. They're actually a perennial, so they can overwinter. But a lot of people, ancestors would lift these every season and then replant the smaller ones in the fall. And this just kind of tells you how to plant the shallots. And if you like steaks, there's a really good recipe in here for a shallot recipe. So again, I'm not going to read this to you word for word. I just want you to make sure you know the difference between onion, shallots, and leeks. There's, again, a little bit of difference, not necessarily in how you grow, but in their texture and in their flavor. And then that brings us to salsify. It's a very ugly plant below ground, but doesn't it throw off a really pretty flower? It's a really pretty plant. Because remember, it's an aster family, so it's going to have a flower that's very similar to that. This is one that, I've grown it just like a couple of plants each year, and I've got my sister growing these. They're just because they're kind of fun. It's known as the oyster plant because it does have an oyster flavor when you cook it. I'm guessing you can eat this raw. I'm not sure. I've never eaten it raw, but cooking it does taste very oystery, and it's just a little bit skinnier version of the parsnip and dandelion, which is also in the aster family. But remember, again, a lot of these weeds, if you can grow a dandelion, you can grow salsify, y'all. And I know none of you have any problem growing dandelions. I'm sure of it. So you should just try a couple of those just to see what you get. And then sunchokes. I think this is a really pretty plant. It's in the sunflower family. You can probably see that here. There's different kinds of helianthus or weeds that we see growing on the medians along roadsides. Not all of those are going to be sunchokes, but a lot of them are. It's just going to be botanically being able to get up close and personal with them. It's hard to see when we're driving by at 80 miles an hour. But anyway, this is the one that we would harvest for that tuber. You'll hear them called sunchokes or Jerusalem artichoke. It is a tuber. Here's where I don't like to say this because I like this plant so much, but it is invasive. So when you get it started, it will tend to come back. That's why we see it on the roadsides. So it's a fun plant. You can actually lift it every year, but you're still going to have some of those little rhizomes that spread. So kind of like comfrey. If you don't want it, or tansy, if you don't want to take over the world, make sure that you know what you're doing with this one. Don't let it get out of hand. Or even if some of you might be planting veg as a cover crop, I always tell you, make sure that you're turning it under, or it can become an invasive weed. So this one can do that, but it's a lot of fun. These are really good. They taste like water chestnuts. But again, if you're planting these, only plant it in the spring. And I guess in a nutshell, I would say kind of treat it like a mint, because mint kind of spreads and takes over the universe. So give it its own little location. But this is one you should really try. It really does add some texture to your flavor profile. As far as pest, they're going to run the gamut, but the ones that we see the most are going to be flea beetles on radishes. I'll say this in the companion plant class, but I will often plant radishes as a trap crop for flea beetles. If you've ever grown eggplant, then you know flea beetles love eggplant. So plant you some radishes close because flea beetles will go the radishes first. But grow different species or cultivars of radishes throughout your garden. They actually prefer the little short, fat red ones. That's the one in my garden, at least, they go to before they go to any of the others. So that's just trial and error. That's not scientific. I'm just telling you what I've experienced here. But plant a lot of different cultivars and use that as a trap crop. Carrots, carrot flies. Carrot fly is going to look very similar to a housefly, but it's a lot smaller. And then lettuces, and if you have green onions in your lettuce bed, slugs love those. So be aware of that. As far as companions, carrots, wormwood, rosemary, all of those are going to act as a repellent to the carrot fly. Of course, some of those are going to be perennial, so make sure when you're planting those. Beets are going to grow really well near bush beans, but they don't like pole beans. So remember that. That's a huge difference. If you have just Blue Lake beans growing, then grow your beets in and around those. But if you have greasy beans that require a trellis, then don't plant your beets anywhere near that. Lettuce is going to grow really well with strawberries, cucumbers, and carrots. If you grow radishes and onions with your lettuce, that's a really good triple crop to grow there. If you're growing a lettuce bed, make sure you keep that away from cabbage because we're going to be growing those crops at the same time. But cabbage is actually going to lessen the flavor of that lettuce. If you get spindly leaves on your lettuce, that might be because you have cabbage growing nearby. Notice here, onions and all members of the cole crops are going to get along really well. Onions do not like a legume, so keep them away from peas and beans. And then notice there too that ornamental relatives of the onion are going to be helpful as protective companions for roses. So another thing to remember too is that maggots travel from plant to plant. So don't let your OCD get you. Just interplant onions throughout the garden, just like you would some of these other companion flowers as well. Think about your marigolds and nasturtiums and things like that. Just kind of scatter those throughout your bed. And I've already kind of alluded to this, or maybe even said it a couple of times, but radishes really are a workhorse. They're going to do lots of things in your garden. The first one I put up here is protecting squash from squash borers. It'll give you a little bit of protection. I've tried that. I tend to get squash borers every year. That's the one that bores in at the stem level. Maybe I've just not planted radishes all around my squash. I don't know, but they do say that they're really good for that. And they also say that deter cucumber beetles and rust flies. Chervil, which is in the same family as celery and nasturtiums, are going to help improve radish growth and flavor. We're going to talk about corn and beans in a couple of weeks. So radishes, if you plant those around your corn and just let those go to seed, they'll help fight corn borers. And it's actually a really pretty plant if you just let it bolt and go to flower. If you do let it go to flower, remember that all the energy in that plant's going to that seed formation. So your root is not going to really be edible. It's going to taste like wooden concrete and it won't be flavorful at all. Leaf miners are really we're starting to see an uptick of that in spinach here. So radishes can actually deter those leaf miners away. Keep them away from hyssop plants, which is like anise, It's a member of the mint family. Keep radishes away from any of your cold crops. It can deter the growth there. The other thing, last thing to mention, and that's kind of where we're going to end up tonight, because we're going to talk more about, like I say, corn and beans the next time. We're going to get into tomatoes and stuff. But radishes are going to be a good indicator of calcium levels in the soil. So as you start that early garden, and this is same in containers, raised beds, or in ground, if that radish grows and only produces a stringy root, then that's going to tell us that we need calcium. And I've eyeballed this on several soil tests and done this in gardens, and it seems to be pretty true. So it's kind of a fun way to tell what our calcium levels are. So why I'm leaving you with that is because not so much next time with corn and beans, but when we do get into tomatoes, you're going to find out calcium is one of those micronutrients we really need. It's going to help us prevent blossom end rot on tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, even watermelons. So radishes, as you're planting early this spring, plant you a couple and kind of gauge where your calcium level is in the soil. So with that, we are going to end up tonight. Let's see what time it is. I don't even know what time it is. 8:04. Yeah, we went a little bit over tonight, but I hope that you've picked up some good growing tips on potatoes, sweet potatoes, and root crops. And I'm anxious to see if any of you tried some of the salsify or the sunchoke, and just kind of see how your potato and your sweet potato crop grows this year. And if you ever need anybody to do any taste testing, y'all just call me, unless it's a beet, and I'm your girl. So look for an email from me later tonight or tomorrow to get you into the Google Drive. There's a lot of information in there. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions at all. That's what we're here for. So I'll see some of you, I think it's April 9th. Just as a snippet, next Monday is my Monday Musing series. So if you're interested in how Easter plants got their start and some of their origins, make sure you join us. And then we're going to take a virtual wildflower hike to see all the spring ephemerals and get you out on the trail virtually. So hopefully I'll see some of you next Monday. I put the link in the chat box a little bit earlier, so you can go find that there. But otherwise, I'll be talking to you a little bit later. So I hope to see y'all soon. Happy gardening.